Hello and welcome back. In this video we'll talk about the Research Data Management Plan and give a brief introduction to the topic. So what is a Research Data Management Plan? The plan describes the whole data lifecycle in our project. It starts with the collection of the data, so here we write down what kind of data we have in our project, including the file types and the formats, which processes we have to acquire the data, which instruments we're going to use and so on, and which relevant metadata do we have. It's also a good idea to estimate the size of the data so we can see if we have maybe a few hundred gigabytes or a few terabytes or maybe even some petabytes of data. We also need to describe how we want to process the data, so how and where do we want to store the data, how do we handle the data, what kind of workflows do we have. It also includes organizational aspect. What kind of responsibilities do we have? Who does what? Who is responsible for which part? We also need to think about how to publish the data and long-term storage. And our Research Data Management Plan should have some details about how we want to accomplish that. If we have any legal obligations or requirements, for example, if we have sensitive industry data or if the data fall under the Data Protection Act, and we also need to include this in a very detailed fashion, how we comply with all the requirements, be it legal or ethical, that we have on our data. So the Research Data Management Plan is something that we start at the beginning of the project, but it's also a living document. So we need to amend as the project matures, for example, if we have new instruments or if we capture more data. So why do we need a Research Data Management Plan? One aspect is that the funding agency often require one, but typically if we want to have fair data, then we need to make sure that our data are findable and also can be described properly. So we need to make sure that all aspects around our data are transparent and explicit. And the Research Data Management Plan helps us to write down and make our assumptions, but also our choices explicit. It also kind of forces ourselves to build a research data map for our projects and how do we plan to adhere to the fair data principles. It also forces us to evaluate if our data collection, processing and storage requirements are suitable and realistic regarding, for example, file formats, infrastructure size and the tools that we're going to use. It also helps us pin down which or how to share part of our data or all of our data, and if we need to consider ethical or legal aspects, how we are going to comply with these requirements. How do we then create such a data management plan? We can start by creating a map of our data processes. We have an inventory of our relevant machines and instruments, and then we can add the details to it, like which file formats and file types do these instruments and machines produce. Then we can map out the data-related processes, such as how do we acquire the data from the machines and instruments, how do we store them, how do we put them into our analysis framework. And then when we have all these entities in our, shall we say, big mind map, we can also add some responsibilities and ownership for the data and processes. So the organizational side, who is responsible for which part of the data and our data workflows. If you have funding from a funding agency, you also need to check the specific requirements. Or maybe your institution has data management plans or specific requirements. So if they have, then you need to follow these rules. Otherwise, you can choose your own. There are, of course, a lot of tools around. So there are typically a predefined template or an online system to start from. And if you apply for specific funding, you may or may not be required to use their specific tool. Otherwise, you can use this list to get a general idea of what data management plan fits your requirements best. So a data management plan makes our assumptions, requirements and processes transparent, including the size, type, the data acquisition, the data processing and the data analysis, the storage and so on. A DMP helps us to make our data comply with the FAIR principles and help us identify which data can be shared with others. It also helps us to navigate the complex ethical, legal or contractual requirements that you may or may not have depending on the project that you work on. And last but not least, it helps you comply with the funding agency requirements. And as you've seen, there are many tools available. Choose the one either that is mandated by your funding agency or the one that you prefer. As an exercise, start with the data mind map. Put in your instruments, put in the data, put in the flows and analysis that you have. Then attach some responsibilities. Also then, to create a more formal data management plan, identify a suitable tool and then write a data management plan for your research project. Ideally, share your DMP with your community so that others can benefit from this as well.